Hello, friends. My name's Ty, and I'm going to read to you. For today, I have another ghost story since we're getting very, very close to Halloween, and I decided to wear my Red Rum t-shirt just to set the mood a little bit. This is a story called We Don't Dare that I wrote a couple of years ago for a contest that didn't win, so I'm going to share it with you now. John didn't like being dead, although he couldn't say he disliked it either. Mostly, it was boring. The only real source of entertainment he and his erstwhile compatriots ever had was when new people moved into the house. What do you figure?" Simon asked, peering over John's shoulder to look out the window. John looked back at the wiry man. He was dressed in dusty overalls, a tattered red cotton shirt and cracked leather boots, the same thing he'd been wearing when he fell off the peak of the barn in the mid-1800s and broke his neck. John didn't know why the dead always haunted the places in the clothing they died in, but they did. He also didn't know why he'd returned to this house, the place he'd grown up, when he died nearly 5,000 miles away in the fields of Passchendaele. He looked down at himself, at the dirty uniform he was doomed to wear. He was always expected to see the handle of a German bayonet that had killed him jutting from his chest, and every once in a while he saw its shadow, just a flickering, but mostly he saw faded cloth and dirt. "Anything interesting?" Simon prompted when John didn't reply. John lifted his chin towards the moving truck that sat in the broad gravel driveway in front of the massive hulking farmhouse. "A woman and 2 kids," he said. "Children?" a voice from across the room asked. John looked over and saw Elaine materialize in the doorway of the attic room. "Oh, I do love children." Elaine, the only person John himself had seen die in the house, when she hung herself in the mid-1950s, skipped across the plank floor, her black leather shoes cracking against the wood. It was the clacking of those shoes that was the most common sign of a haunting in the house. The rest of them kept pretty much to themselves. It took an incredible amount of energy to actually affect the living, and any physical action that John had taken since his death had left him feeling as though he'd been turned inside out with a shovel for days after. For some reason, though, everyone who stayed under the roof of the sprawling house heard Elaine's footsteps. "More children?" The house's original builder, Ronald Bourne, said as he appeared to John's left. Ronald had been at the house since he purchased the land and built the original farmhouse in the 1820s. He was a man of later years who had lived in the house until a series of poor business decisions had led him to squander the substantial fortune he brought with him from Ireland, and culminated in him drinking a bottle of good whiskey and eating a bullet from his antique pistol. Ronald still thought of the property as the Bourne Mansion, although it had been bought and sold at least 20 times in the last 200 years, with a few dozen more temporary occupants. "Oh, we're just rid of the last batch of children, weren't we?" Ronald asked. "I don't know if I'm ready for so much noise again." "It's been years since we had children here, Ronald," Elaine said. "It'll be good to hear the sound of small voices again." Elaine had hung herself from the railing of the upstairs balcony after her husband had left her because she bore him no children. It had actually been the husband who was failing during the attempts at conception. John didn't know quite how he knew that, and certainly couldn't figure out a way to break it to Elaine. Now, she was delighted every time a family with children moved into the house. She was constantly hurting herself trying to comfort the children or keep them from harming themselves, no matter how many days she had to spend in agony. She was always anxious to do it again. "How long has it been since we heard a child's laughter in these drafty rooms, John?" Elaine asked him, gripping his arm and bouncing on her clattering shoes. "How long?" John rubbed at his chin, which was eternally covered with 3 days' growth of beard, and thought. Time was thin when you were dead, and the memory of a ghost was unreliable. It could have been a year since the last family moved out of the old house, or it might have been 20. John couldn't be sure. He glanced over at Elaine, meeting her blue eyes for only a moment, and then turned back to the window and shrugged. In front of the moving truck was a shining silver car. John didn't know what brand it was. When he'd been alive, automobiles had been a relatively new thing, and the only kind available for a regular person to buy was the kind that Henry Ford sold. The car in the driveway might as well have been a spaceship from an old science fiction magazine. A slender, pretty, dark-haired woman walked from the front porch of the house and opened the hatch in the back of the shining car, while she gestured to 2 burly moving men who were lugging a couch from the back of the truck. She was the kind of woman that John would have asked to dance if he were alive, and when he felt, as he often did, vaguely irked that he could do nothing more than watch her walk by. 2 girls, the first about 12, the second about half that, followed their mother to the back of the car. The first girl, whose auburn hair laid on her back in a thick braid, bounded between the house and the car, a burbling laughter escaping her lips. The second girl, whose hair was black as coal and fell loose about her shoulders, was more subdued, walking as though she were carrying something heavy. "Those two hardly look related," Simon commented. John nodded. The only similarity he could see was the blue of their eyes. "John, why is she so sad?" Elaine asked, grabbing his arm again. He started to shrug in reply, but then stopped when he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A shadow that followed the girl with the coal-black hair. It took John several moments to realize there was something wrong. The day was cloudy, and no one else cast a shadow, but a huge dark shape was attached to the child's heels, following her. "What the hell is that?" John asked no one in particular. "What the hell is what?" Simon asked, standing on his toes to peer over John's shoulder. "I don't see—" The old farmer trailed off. "Jumping Jesus, what is that?" Elaine and Ronald crowded in behind John to peer out the window. After the old Irishman had had a look, he let out a startled cry and stepped backwards, his hands flying up in front of his face. "What is it?" John asked, standing from his seat on the windowsill. "It is—" Ronald peered out from behind his hands. "No, I dare not say." Simon glared at him, his long neck sticking out from the flannel shirt with the tendons standing out on both sides. "Spit it out, Ronald. What is that thing coming into our house?" "It is—" Ronald took in a shuddering breath. "A slua." Simon jerked his chin back as though he were avoiding a punch. "A what?" Ronald flapped his arms, huffing out his breath. "A slua, you idiot!" John had no idea what the old man was on about. The looks on the faces of the others, they didn't either. "A slua," Ronald repeated. "The unsanctified, the vengeful dead, the stealers of souls." John looked back out the window at the slump-shouldered little girl. "Don't look like there is much in her to steal." "We should drive it off," Elaine said, and gripped John's arm again. "You're a soldier, John. You could fight it." Snorting, John pulled his arm from his grip. "I was, 100 years ago, and seemed to be a little short of weaponry." "Don't sit right," Simon said, glaring at the huge shape that trailed the girl. "Letting a thing like that come in my house." "It's my house," Ronald said, tilting his nose up a little, which he always did when he took to discussing property rights. "And there is nothing to be done. There is no help for the child." "And what do you know about this thing?" John asked, turning and facing the old man. "How do you know what it is?" "No," Ronald said, shaking his head. "I dare not say." Still shaking his head, he turned and walked from the room, fading through the wall. "Let's have a better look," Simon said, hustling from the room. No matter how many years he had to get used to it, John was still surprised that the farmer's heavy, square-toed boots didn't clump on the floor. He passed as silently as a ghost. John followed him to the hallway, then down the stairs. Ghosts didn't walk, necessarily. They kind of flitted. John felt like he was walking, but just like time, distance was a little thin. With a few steps and a little thought, he was in the foyer of the big house, standing on a threadbare rug tacked to the scuffed pale wood floor. The dark-haired woman stepped off the porch and through the wide door, carrying a laundry basket heaped with messily folded clothes, the muscles of her slender arms standing out in relief beneath her tan skin. She looked over her shoulder. "Jill, come on. Help me make the mover some sandwiches." "Coming, Mom," the elder of the two girls said, bounding through the door and down the hall towards the kitchen. "Come on, Jenna," she called to her younger sister. The smaller child shuffled through the doorway and into the foyer. She stood with her head down, looking at the toes of her dusty pink shoes. John had seen that posture in men who had spent a month in the trenches, repelling determined attackers. It did not belong on the shoulders of a child. Behind her, the shadow, the slua, drifted in, getting thicker as it crossed the threshold. John didn't know much about the spirit world, since his greatest source of information was a dour Irishman who never said anything unless it was a complaint. But one thing he did know was that some places haunted easier than others. That was how so many of them came to this old farmhouse. The thing that followed the child seemed to swell as it stood in the old house, growing bigger and darker, its insubstantial form taking on a distinct shape. It looked now like a huge, broad-shouldered man, still faceless, but with heavily muscled arms and torso. As one of the movers walked towards him and down the hallway, a stocky, balding man, whistling tunelessly as he tugged at the cuffs of his leather work gloves. John instinctively stepped aside, but Simon ignored him, allowing the mover to walk right through him. No matter how long John had been dead, he could not get used to the idea of people using him like a curtain. The mover gave a wave and a smile to the slump-shouldered girl, but gave no indication that he saw the black shape. As the mover was about to pass by, the Slua drifted up close, sprang forward to envelop the man in his black shape, then moved aside. In that moment of envelopment, the mover lost his balance, tripped on his own feet, and fell directly onto the child. The mover was quick, for such a big man, and managed to twist aside and avoid landing directly on her, but his big shoulder still slammed into her and knocked her sprawling onto the floor. John leapt forward to come to the girl's aid, and then faltered and flexed his hands, realizing how useless the gesture was. "Holy crap," the mover said as he got to his knees and climbed to his feet. "I'm sorry, kid. Are you all right?" The pretty dark-haired woman ran out of the kitchen and into the entryway. "Jenna, what happened?" The mover looked up from where he bent over the supine girl. "I'm really sorry, Jasmine. I tripped and fell right onto the poor kid." John looked down at the child. She lay on her back, looking up at the ceiling, her dark hair falling in strands across her pale face. She didn't cry or shout for her mother. She simply stared and sighed, as though this was something that happened on a regular basis and did not surprise her in the least. John turned and looked at the Slua, who stood beside the stairs, its wide, shapeless face turned toward them. If it had eyes, it would have been staring straight at John. It was both unashamed and unrepentant, John thought, as well as amused. Slowly the child got to her feet and resumed her slump-shoulder posture, her hair once again in her face. "Are you all right, Jenna?" the dark woman, Jasmine, asked. The child shrugged and continued to look at the space in front of her shoes. Jasmine put her arm around the child's shoulders. "Come on, and we'll get something for lunch." The child allowed herself to be guided down the hallway towards the kitchen, walking directly in front of John and the other occupants. As she passed, she glanced up, her eyes meeting John's for a flickering instant. Neither Simon nor Ronald noticed, but Elaine gripped John's arm again. "She knows we're here, John," she said, standing on her tiptoes to whisper in his ear, despite the fact that no one would be able to hear her voice in over 50 years. "We have to do something to help her." He rubbed at his permanently stubbled jaw as the girl passed the Slua and fell in behind her. The thing turned its blank face and seemed to glance over its shoulder at John, and if he didn't know better, he'd swear the bastard was laughing. "I keep telling you," Ronald said, wringing his narrow hands. "There's nothing we can do. We don't dare." Elaine glared at him, her dark curls framing her scowl. "You can stay here and quiver if you want, but I won't let that thing torment that child." She turned with a flip of her hair and stepped briskly down the hall, her elbows locked and her fist bunched at her side. John looked at Simon, and together the two ghosts hurried after her. "What is that damn fool woman going to do?" Simon asked. "Even dead women are nuts." John said nothing, but heard Ronald muttering as the old man stood in the hallway. "We don't dare," the old man said as he continued to wring his hands. Turning sideways and bumping into each other to get into the entry, the living passed through them as though they were nothing more than mist, but they still had the uncanny ability to knock into each other. John and Simon arrived on Elaine's heels. Jenna stood on the far side of a broad kitchen island at the elbow of her mother, who was slicing thick sandwiches with a kitchen knife while the elder girl, Jill, cut the core out of half an apple. All three women were looking in their direction, at the space Elaine occupied. "What was that sound?" Jasmine asked. "Sounded like footsteps," Jill said. Jenna said nothing, but stood with her hands at her side, looking directly at Elaine. The dark-haired ghost stood with her feet set apart and her fists on her hips, staring at the Slua. The creature stood in the corner of the room, still as a trunk of an oak. It appeared to John that the thing was even more solid than before. Gone was the wafting, indistinct outline, replaced by heavily muscled limbs with broad, sloping shoulders. Its face, which had been a flat plane only moments before, was beginning to take on shape. There was the beginning of a nose and ears, the slim line of a mouth. "Get out of this house!" Elaine shrieked at the Slua, as the thing stood, impassive, its face turned in her direction. "Get out of this house, you bastard, and leave the children alone!" The Slua gave no response, and simply stood. "Jenna," the eldest of the three living women said, "would you grab some plates from the china cabinet?" Wordlessly, the child turned and walked across the room, towards the slua, to where the tall antique china cabinet stood. Her path took her directly towards Elaine, who was still glaring at the slua. Before the child walked through her, Jenna turned slightly to her right and angled her slim shoulders so she didn't touch Elaine's elbow. John and Simon looked at each other. "She really does know we're here," the old farmhand said. As the child reached the cabinet, she swung open one of the doors and stood on her toes to reach a stack of thin plates on a shelf just above the level of her eyes. As she reached, the slua's thin mouth parted in a grin, and it reached out one thick arm and gave the cabinet a powerful shove. Jenna looked up, her blue eyes wide, as the crockery stacked in the cabinet shifted violently and began sliding off the shelves. Elaine gasped and flitted forward. She let out a cry as she reached up a hand to hold the cabinet while she shoved the child sprawling away. The cry was filled with agony, and a bright spot of light bloomed in the center of Elaine's body. Her scream turned to a desperate wail as she shoved with both hands, her pale arms on the cabinet, crashed backwards into the wall. Plates and cups fell to shatter on the floor, but John couldn't hear them over the terrifying pitch of Elaine's scream. The dark-haired ghost doubled over, clutching at her stomach, while the spot grew so bright it was hard to look at, and the light had grown so as it looked as though Elaine were being consumed from the inside by a small star. The slua lunged forward and smothered her. The solid outline of its body disappeared and covered Elaine's form in an inky black shroud. As it covered her, her scream cut off so suddenly that John thought he'd been struck deaf. The shape of the slua roiled for a handful of heartbeats, then shrunk, and finally formed back into the heavily muscled shape. When it stood upright and turned its face towards John and Simon, Elaine was gone. The slua smiled. Its previous flat face now featured with a sharp nose, broad ears, and a wide mouth filled with rows of teeth that were a sickly shade of gray. Its eyes were a pale white, the same color that had been pouring from Elaine when it consumed her, glowing in its black face. "What, in the name of suffering Christ?" Simon said, lifting up an arm to cover his face as though he were stifling a sneeze. "Where is she?" John turned his head to see Jasmine hurrying across the room to skid to a stop on her knees beside Jenna. The child was up on her elbows, staring at the place where Elaine had been and the slua now stood. "Jenna, what happened?" Jasmine asked as she pushed strands of her hair away from the child's face. "Did you climb the cabinet?" "She didn't climb it, Mom," Jill said from behind her, still holding half an apple and a small paring knife. "The cabinet fell over by itself, and then something pushed it back." The elder daughter dropped both the knife and the apple and clapped her hands to her face. "It's happening again. You said it would stop when we moved, but it's happening again." "No," the eldest woman said. "Nothing is happening. Jenna knocked over the cabinet is all." The child glanced over at her mother, then back at the space where the slua stood, but said nothing. "She's gone," Simon said, reaching out a permanently calloused hand to grip the shoulder of John's uniform. "She's gone, John. That thing took her. How did it take her?" John looked from the slua and down the hallway behind him. Ronald was gone. "I don't know," the soldier said, looking back at the slua. "But I have an idea who does." John turned, thought of the attic, and flitted through the house. He found Ronald sitting in a dusty chair, rocking back and forth while he hugged himself. After a moment, Simon appeared at John's elbow. "What is that thing, old man?" John stepped forward and grabbed Ronald by the lapels of his coat, dragging him from the chair. The old man did nothing more than whimper and John gave him a shake. "You know what that thing is, don't you? You've seen it before." Ronald shook his head and whimpered. His eyes rolling, he looked around the room as though seeking rescue. John yanked the old man towards him so their noses were almost touching. "Tell me!" he shouted. "I told you, there's no help for the child." Ron's eyes continued to spin around the room. "We don't dare." "What about Elaine?" Simon said from over John's shoulder. "What happened to her?" "She is gone," Ronald said, the last word extending into a small wail. "What do you mean, gone?" John asked, and gave the old man another shake. "That is what a slua does," Ronald said, his voice dropping to a whisper and his hands clutching at John's forearms. "It is one of the forsaken, neither completely dead nor alive, welcome in neither heaven nor hell, and rejected by the earth itself." He looked around the room again and ran his tongue across wrinkled lips. John didn't think it was possible for a man who was almost 2 centuries dead to look nervous. "You've seen something like this before, haven't you, you old son of a bitch?" Simon said. Yes, Ronald nodded. Long ago, before you, Simon. There were others here, people from before this house was built. A Slua came and took all of them except for me. It feeds off pain. It will continue to plague the child until she is dead, and will feed off us if we try and help and make ourselves vulnerable. That's what happened to Elaine? John asked. That thing ate her? Ronald nodded and continued to clutch at John's arms. The soldier let the man go, and he slumped backwards into the dusty chair. John turned away and rubbed at his stubbled cheeks. We do nothing, and that thing kills the girl. We try and stop it, and we get et ourselves, Simon said, standing in the center of the room with his hands on his hips. John ran his hand over his hair that hadn't changed in 100 years, and never would again. For all the time that John had hunkered in this dusty attic, watching people come and go, wondering at what purpose there could possibly be for him in remaining in this place. There was nothing for him to do, nor for him to go, no way for him to move on. He'd hungered for life when he was a man, and now that he was a ghost, he grew tired of it. When he thought of the smiling face of the demon downstairs and the wide, terrified eyes of the child who seemed like she could see him, he stopped wondering. I can't let this stand, John said, and turned for the door. What are you on about, John? Simon said and caught his arm. John stopped and turned to Simon. For whatever this place is worth, it's my home, and I won't let some black devil kill a child under my roof. He pulled his arm from Simon's grip. What do you mean to do? Simon asked. Whatever I can, John said, and thought of the kitchen. He flitted through the house and planted his feet in the center of the scuffed wood kitchen floor. Jenna sat in a chair pulled up to a narrow table. Her mother sat on her left, and her sister across from her. The Slua stood behind her, leaning on the back of her chair, and seemed to be drawing in long breaths with his face above the child's drooping head. John could see waves, faint as a shimmer off a pool of gasoline, coming off the child. Whatever the waves were, the Slua seemed to be enjoying them. The child looked up, her eyes peering at John from behind the dirty tangle of her hair. The Slua looked up as well, and when it saw John, its eyes brightened and its toothy mouth widened in a smile. It was the smile a coyote gave a chicken with a lame foot. He thought though he had not felt things like hunger or thirst or the bite of cold since his death, John's mouth suddenly went dry, and his short hair stood on end with a chill that bloomed up from his spine. The Slua stepped around the end of a table, its hand passing over the head of the child as it came for John. John looked around for something, anything to use as a weapon, then remembered he couldn't pick anything up. As his fear grew, he felt a burning sensation in his chest. He looked down and saw the flickering handle of the German bayonet standing out from his body. Gritting his teeth, John summoned whatever lay in the center of his heart, his will, his courage. Whatever it was, he called upon it, and the handle of the bayonet stopped flickering and stayed steady. Before he could think about it too much, John grasped the bayonet and wrenched it free. There was no blood from the wound, only an agonizing pain and a bloom of white light. Howling in pain and rage, John raised his eyes from his chest to the face of the Slua. The creature stopped moving and stared at John, its long black tongue flickering over gray teeth. "Come on, then, you evil bastard," John shouted, his voice strong despite the searing pain in his chest. "Let that child be, and come see what you're made of." The Slua flowed forward, its movement as smooth and liquid as black water, and John lunged to meet it. The Slua's arms slung about him, trapping his own, and John felt a cold like he'd never known in all his days of life envelop him. He scrabbled and screamed, but the icy grip only tightened. He looked over the creature's shoulder and saw Jenna, her blue eyes wide and her fingers dug into the edge of the table. "Jenna, what is it?" Jasmine asked her daughter, reaching out to lay a hand on Jenna's arm. At her mother's touch, Jenna stood up as suddenly as though she had been blasted out of her seat. "No!" the child screamed, her voice so high and piercing it made Elaine's dying wail seem a whisper. The Slua started at the sound, its head turning towards the child and its grip loosening. With a roar, John pulled back the arm holding the bayonet and rammed it into the Slua's body. The creature let out a dull roar and liquid shadows spilled from its wound. The light from John's chest flared a brilliant white and pounded against the Slua, driving the shadows back. John had time to look at the child, Jenna, and see a smile cross her face. And then the world was lost in a flash of white light. Simon stepped into the kitchen. There was nothing left of John or the Sluagh, except a wisp of smoke and the bayonet, the blade steaming on the floor. Simon looked up at the girl who was standing facing her mother. "Jenna, are you all right?" Jasmine asked. The child nodded. "Yes, Mom. I'm going to be all right now." Simon stooped down to pick up the bayonet and slid it through the loop on his overalls. He looked up into the rafters above the kitchen and nodded. "I'll see to it, John," he said. "I'll see to it." Thanks very much for being here with me today, friends. I really hope you liked that story because I had a good time reading it.